Hello and welcome to Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics, where we're revisiting the Walt Disney animated classics to see which ones deserve the title of a Waly Gisnep animated classic. Our exclusive list of excellent films named for Walt Disney's wonky signature as read by a 4-year-old. As always, I am Liam and I am joined by my friend Ben. Ben, what are we looking at today?
This week, Liam, we are discussing the fifth film in the Disney animated classics canon, the 1942 film Bambi.
Right out of the gate, Ben, what are your overall thoughts about Bambi?
I was discussing this with someone, and their summary was, this film doesn't have a plot, and rewatching it, they are correct.
I've actually only recently seen Bambi for the first time. I'm not sure how, but this is a film I never saw as a child. And for some strange reason, over the years, I'd got it into my head that this film does have a plot. And when I watched it for the first time, you can imagine my surprise to realise that no, there's nothing in this film.
Now, before we kick it to pieces completely, I think the premise of it is basically, here's a year in the forest, and we explore the flora and fauna of everything in the forest in that time.
I will add, I do like Bambi. I was really surprised by it. The first time I watched it, I really enjoyed it, and there was a lot I wasn't expecting. However, rewatching it for this, I did find it a bit tedious to get through.
In my head, I often pair it with Dumbo because I think, okay, these are both films exploring the animal kingdom. Admittedly, Dumbo's animal kingdom is in cages and is horrible. But actually, for me, it's more like Fantasia. A lot of the sequences are basically just music and colour. There's very little dialogue, and really, the characters basically have no personality. Maybe Thumper has the most, and Thumper's personality is, it's a cute rabbit that thumps.
You mentioned Fantasia, and one thing I do enjoy about this film is the sequences where the animation seems to go a lot softer, and there is music, and it's all non-verbal. All of those sequences I really like. However, it's constantly interrupted with lots of annoying child animals speaking.
On that note then, shall we start going through... I was going to say the plot. Shall we start going through the chronological scenes that happen in this film? I'm going to point out my favourite name in the credits. I suspect after we get past the 40s, these are going to be less ridiculous, but there was a Chuck Couch who worked on this film.
Speaking of the credits, this film, more than any, I really can't wait until we're past the era of filmmaking where the credits are front-loaded. Over the overly long front-loaded credits, we have quite a generic choral song of Love is a Song That Never Ends, I believe it might be called.
I'll be honest, I didn't bother to check the name of it. It's so forgettable.
Throughout this, we're treated to some really nice shots of the forest. Is it considered a shot of the forest when it's in animation?
I'd say so.
But there's lots of nice backgrounds, basically. It goes on for a bit too long. It almost feels like a comedic beat, where it's stretching to the side. You're expecting it to reveal something, and after about 3.5 minutes, you've still not been shown anything. But what this is all leading up to is all of the animals in the forest are really excited about the birth of a new prince. My first thought was, it seems a bit much and they're putting a bit too much stock in the birth of this prince. And then I remembered, obviously we're in Britain and the birth of a new member of the royal family is greeted with much more pomp and circumstance. If anything, the animals are really reserved. They just sort of gather around and say congratulations. There's no, silly outfits and bunting.
The animals do get a day off, though, and go out and get absolutely smashed. So they all gather round immediately after Bambi's mum has given birth to him. Now, I don't have a lot of experience of this, but I suspect mothers who've literally just given birth don't want everyone they know standing around them and staring at them.
This is just the price of royalty, though. You've got to immediately put on your makeup, get out, and greet the masses.
Now, my question is... Well, I've got a few questions. My first question is, how did the deer become the monarchs of the forest? They're not even predators. Surely the bear outranks the deer.
I like to think there was a first draft of Bambi, which was about bears, and they
Bambi. Thank you.
And Walt Disney realised that opening scene with all of the fauna surrounding this bear, they'd just get eaten.
So it's a 2-scene film. Credits, bear eats all the animals. Done. So the obvious comparison point is The Lion King here.
Yes. As an overall review of this film, I would say it's very pretty. I love the idea of it. However, just watch The Lion King.
It's uncanny how similar they are. So the opening is all these animals rushing through their kingdom to see the newborn prince. First half of the film is that newborn prince learning about the world and learning about the dangers of it. Then the second half is a showdown with another one of their species, someone trapped on a rock surrounded by fire, a fight with a bunch of dog-like creatures, and then everything's fine, and then it ends again with another prince being born. I realise I've skipped ahead quite a lot there, but it's exactly the same plot structure.
Honestly, Ben, I think that's all we need to say about the plot, because as there's not much to it. We can recount the plot as much as we like, but I would much rather talk about how much I despise Thumper.
Wow, that wasn't the angle I was expecting. So Thumper is obviously the first animal Bambi meets after his own mother, and Bambi's mother is very quick to delegate almost all teaching responsibilities to Thumper. She doesn't bother to teach Bambi how to walk or talk. That's all on Thumper. Why do you hate Thumper so much?
First off, and at the risk of upsetting a lot of people, I don't like child actors. I don't think anyone that young can act. And what we have here is they've just shoved a small child into a recording booth. It just sounds like they are reading lines. He also has the most annoying laugh in all of the Disney canon.
I think that's relatively fair. I actually am just going to say, I think you hate bad child actors, which is what 99% of child actors are. But then I saw Kick-Ass and saw Hit Girl. I was like, oh wait, children can act. It's just most of the time they pick a child that can't act and then they don't give them any good direction.
Again, I'm fairly biased because we're based in Britain, and you say that, 99% of child actors can't act. I would say that in Britain, 100% of child actors cannot act. That 1% that you're referring to are all just child prodigies in America who have been pushed from a very young age to put the work in, but to be passionate about acting, so they themselves, want to succeed.
I think you're right. I can't think of a good British child actor. We put the best ones in Harry Potter, and they're terrible.
If your only reference is Harry Potter, go out and see British productions. A recent one is there was a Amazon production of Good Omens, which I was really excited for because I think the book is excellent and I wanted to see how to do an adaptation of it. There are things that don't adapt very well about it, and I think they handled them really well. The whole series is let down by just bad acting from the children.
And in that story, the children are integral to it as well. You can't gloss over it, unfortunately. On a complete side note, I'd recommend the radio adaptation over the TV version.
Which leads me to my point about voice acting. You don't need to get a child in a booth. Honestly, most of this podcast is just going to be me complaining about child voice actors.
And they don't exclusively use children, because Disney stalwart Sterling Holloway, famously voice of Winnie the Pooh, does voice one of the young animals for some reason.
Well, he's right at the end and he voices the adult version of Flower, and we'll get to Flower. He's literally got one line at the end. So just do what TV series, like animated TV series, have been doing for the last 30 years and just hire an adult woman to do an impression of a small child. I'm not sure who the 1942 equivalent of Tara Strong or Nancy Cartwright was, but just get them.
But you have to remember, Liam, as we discussed in Snow White, all the women actors at this point had a voice far too high-pitched for even a child.
So Thumper's already fighting an uphill battle against me. I just think he's an annoying character. And you're right, all of the child-rearing is delegated to Thumper. And he's not particularly great at it. He just mocks Bambi's attempts.
I don't know what your experience of parenting was, Liam, but that sounds very consistent.
When people think of Bambi, they think of a fumbling about little baby deer. That's something that Thumper is immediately jumping on as something to mock. But then he tries to teach him to speak, and there's this whole sequence where Thumper says bird, and he's trying to get Bambi to say bird, and it goes on, and it's just two children in a recording booth making noises, and I hate it.
Again, you can look at modern examples where they've done it right. I don't know if you've ever seen any footage of them recording Boo for Monsters, Inc., but it's literally just chasing a toddler around with a microphone. And that's why it works so well, because it's not someone pretending to be a mad toddler. It is a mad toddler that they've recorded and animated.
That's fine. I'm not saying that using child actors can't be good. For the most part, I don't think a child can pretend to be sincere. You just have to capture it.
One thing I noticed in the opening of this film, and this probably links into one of the reasons you don't like Thumper, is every single character, with the exception of the owl, has the Disney eyes. The very big eyes that are coloured and shaped in a certain way. I can't really describe them on a podcast, but you know what I'm talking about if you're listening to this.
If you are struggling to picture this, we're just talking about the Anna and Elsa eyes, who actually, now I think about it, are the only characters in Frozen with, I suppose their mum has it because they're all just the same character model, but everyone has fairly normal proportions, and then they've just got these massive eyes that take up probably 50% of their skull cavity.
As nature intended.
Talking of Thumper and his eyes, is Thumper the only boy in his family? Disney does the very on-the-nose animation to separate males and females, and Thumper has potentially green eyes and sort of lighter fur, and all of his siblings have blue eyes, slightly pinkish fur, and also sexy eyelashes.
You say that Disney characterises gender in a very standard way, but the way they characterise Flower is unusual because Flower is called Flower and likes flowers and has big long eyelashes, and young Flower's voice sounds like a female voice. I think a lot of people when they first watch this film will assume that character's intended to be female. And then when Flower grows up and has hey, how you doing, boys? type voice, it's very jarring.
When we first meet Flower, he is weirdly flirty with Bambi. I believe he has a line which is just, he can call me Flower if he wants to. Which maybe you're listening to that and you're like, that's not that flirty. The delivery on this line, again, I don't think the child actor they had really understood what they were going for. Sorry, I will say, this whole podcast, you could stop listening now if you're not up for another half an hour of me just shitting on child actors.
Well, we can circle back to children actors then. One thing that definitely stands out for me as I watch these innumerable sequences of Bambi learning about different things is, building off the back of Dumbo, the attention to detail and love that they've crafted in how they animate each animal is very prevalent. You talk about these beautiful forest landscapes that they've painted, basically, and the detail of how these animals move, I think, is really an amazing achievement, and it stands out as a landmark for Disney in that this is the first time I think they nail that balance of the animals being proportioned and moving fairly naturalistically, but also having those cute Disneyfied features and anthropomorphic movements and behaviours, with one exception, and that's the owl, because Disney do not understand how owls' necks work. They can't just spin indefinitely.
The owl is terrifying. There's something about the way they've chosen to animate him, just an old man who's never been in a relationship because they're bad news. He's basically grumpy in owl form. Regarding how it looks and the attention to detail that's gone into it, I will say, aside from one film that's coming up, this is probably, of all the films that Walt Disney himself worked on, the best looking film.
I'm tempted to agree with that. I'm scanning through my head and there's only one I would say I think looks better, and I think we're agreeing on what that one is. But we'll come to that in good time. Certainly up until this point, and for the next... certainly the next 6 films, it looks a lot better than all those as well.
In fact, rather than recommending the film as a whole, if you're just after the opportunity to look at a really well-animated and beautiful sequence, just look up the April Showers sequence, which is what immediately follows. And it's the fact that you get a bit of whiplash from, you've got this horrible scene of Thumper teaching Bambi. That ends, and then you have this wonderful scene. So I actually would prefer this film if it was entirely non-verbal. And I think there is a cut out there where you can take out almost all of the dialogue.
You're right, I can't think of any lines of dialogue that are absolutely necessary to telling the plot. And you're right also that they make a big deal about Thumper teaching Bambi to speak, but Bambi barely has any dialogue in this film. No character does, really. So it's a strange aspect of Bambi's growth to focus on, given Bambi then goes on to say about 6 more things.
As I mentioned, I hadn't seen this film until very recently, like within the last couple of months. And I had always assumed that, like Dumbo, Bambi was a non-verbal character. So when I watched it, I was like, oh, he speaks. That's not what I was expecting. I'm not sure why I never saw this film. I'm not sure if my parents thought it would scar me, or they just rightfully assessed that it's not a very interesting film.
Maybe they just knew you would hate Thumper, and they went, That is a boy who won't like that rabbit. Let's keep them as far apart as possible.
It's almost impossible to not just absorb the film via osmosis. Just by existing in a culture where Bambi exists, you know most of the plot. I will say, nothing surprised me other than Bambi speaking up until the midpoint of the film, you'd call it, which is Bambi's mum's death. Spoiler, if you're not aware, Bambi's mum gets shot. It's also what everyone thinks of when they think of Bambi. And up to that point, the film played out pretty much as I was expecting, annoying rabbit and all. And then from that point, I will say I'm pleasantly surprised, but we'll get to that. But first we have to get to Bambi's mum getting shot. So all of the animals go to this big meadow, and we're told straight away that the meadow is dangerous and not to rush out. Again, I think this could be done very well non-verbally, so that's a piece of dialogue that, whilst important, can go. All the animals sort of faff about in the meadow. Bambi ruins a couple of ducks' days, I think. Thumper decides not to eat his vegetables because for some reason they had to throw that message into this film. I'm not sure what part of the animation studio was insistent on. We've got to have a message about eating your vegetables, kids, even though it's a rabbit who exclusively eats vegetables.
Thumper says the reason to eat them is so you get big feet.
Long ears and big feet.
What every child wants.
And then Bambi meets Feline?
I had to look it up to make sure I'd caught it right, because I swear they say it slightly differently every time.
She's just an effeminate version of Bambi, and they just kind of prance about, and she's a bit more confident. If you've seen The Lion King, it's just Nala and Simba.
But worse and more boring.
We should point out, obviously The Lion King came much later. If anything is copying anything, The Lion King's copying Bambi.
Okay, so I won't say Bambi's worse and more boring. I'll say The Lion King's better and more interesting.
There we go.
I did a thumbs up then. I realised that doesn't work on an audio recording. Just picture it. Google thumbs up.
So Bambi and Feline are faffing about, clearly having their meet cute, and then all the male deer...
Their what?
Their meet cute.
What's a meet cute?
A meet cute, it's in rom-coms and I suppose just films in general. It's the scene in which our love interests meet.
Oh, I thought you meant meat as in MEAT. I was like, I mean, I guess they are meat and they're quite cute. I guess that works.
So after the meet cute, all the male deer suddenly show up and are fighting, and then we're finally introduced to Bambi's absentee deadbeat dad.
There's a weird absence of dads in this film.
I think that's just Walt Disney saying that that's just nature. I think he might have been trying to get out of a custody suit or something.
It's natural that the dad just stands there and looks out at everything and does basically nothing.
Even if he is revered by everyone as a great animator, I mean dear. There's then a really nice non-verbal sequence where Man shows up, everything gets very dramatic, the colours change, animation's gorgeous, and they run away, and everyone is safe, but obviously it's setting up that, hey, Man is dangerous. And then we just kind of skip over autumn, despite the fact this is a film where they want to do a year in the life of nature. Autumn comes just as a couple of leaves dropping off, and then there's snow, which I'm fine, because the snow sequence, again, is absolutely gorgeous. You cut out Thumper mocking Bambi on the ice, it's a perfect scene.
I still can't believe your main complaint of this film is Thumper. If you put a gun to my head and said, who's the cutest, most popular character in Bambi, I would have guessed Thumper. I would never put it as Thumper's what ruins this film. In my notes, I put bunnies are cute. I literally just wrote that because I was like, oh, I like bunnies, they're cute.
All the bunnies are cute, but as soon as they speak, they're just incredibly annoying.
You hear that, rabbits?
So we sort of go throughout winter and we can see there's a bit of hardship. Quick question, do deer actually eat bark during the winter? Because that seems miserable.
I was wondering that. I mean, are they migratory animals, deer? We should have done some research, really. Hang on, we'll just pause and then when we come back, I'll know everything about deer.
No, it's the job of the animators to do all the research for us. Because clearly we're not supposed to be entertained by this film, we're supposed to be educated.
Well, as I know off the top of my head, white-tailed deer may be a lovely sight in the woods, but they can do serious damage to trees, shrubs and other plants. They eat the bark of young trees, as well as any twigs, buds, acorns and berries they can reach.
Basically, life as a deer seems miserable. It's unintentionally hilarious, where Bambi just sort of looks at his mum and one of his 4 lines of dialogue is, I'm hungry, and she just looks at him and says, I know, end of conversation.
I'm not going to introduce you to your dad, teach you how to speak, and I don't care if you're hungry. And people get sad when she dies.
Could you imagine if they did that with Mufasa?
What's that shadowy place over there? I don't know, go and have a look. I'm a busy man. Lion.
So this time, winter starts to break, and this time Man comes back, and unfortunately Bambi's mum does get shot. At least we're led to believe she gets shot. She could come back in the sequel. We don't see it on screen.
Oh, I thought you were going to suggest she faked her death. she was just sick of having to look after Bambi.
He's got a thumper. He'll be fine.
I've written down that there is no reason not to think that the unseen, unheard hunter in this film is Gaston.
Oh, that would be excellent.
Think about it. He loves hunting. He's a great shot. He uses antlers in all of his decorating.
You say he's a great shot, but there is a sequence where all the animals are running away from the hunters, and they are shooting with just gay abandon. They're missing, they're shooting holes, and it's like, this isn't how you hunt. You're supposed to be sort of calm and collected, not just see a group of small animals and rodents running away from you and just fire blindly into them.
I would wager, even if they'd hit the vole with their shotgun, there wouldn't be a lot of vole left. In their defence, though, they managed to clip Bambi when he's jumping over a river. That's a pretty damn good shot. Have you ever tried hitting a deer jumping over a river?
So my question is Bambi's mum's death traumatic? So I never experienced this as a child, and I know that everyone's sort of like, oh, it's so sad. But we've already shown she's not a great mum. She's not even a particularly present character.
I think it's a really good example of less not always being more. The death of Mufasa, the most heart-rending part of that is Simba cuddling up to his dad's dead body and just wishing he was still alive. In the last episode, we talked about Dumbo and how the most traumatic and upsetting scene is them barely being able to touch trunks through the bars. Given we've established we think this is a film that would work well entirely visually, I think the absence of that visual element does take away some of the impact, particularly following Dumbo, which is a film entirely dedicated to mother-related trauma.
What you're saying is, if they're going to show a sad elephant swaying side to side, we should see the mangled corpse of a deer.
Correct.
So it's at this point that Bambi's deadbeat dad decides to show up and finally sort of take Bambi under his wing a bit. They're not too much, keep his distance. And from this point, when I was watching this the first time, I knew nothing. I had no idea what was going to happen. The fact that we cut forward and Bambi is a young adult with horns blew my mind.
I think that aspect of the film is something that hasn't permeated mainstream culture anywhere near as much. What people remember is the first half of the film. It's like Full Metal Jacket. Everyone's familiar with the first half, but no one really remembers the second half.
I never thought I'd see Bambi compared to a Stanley Kubrick film. So we're now in Bambi's awkward teenage years. They've hired a young man to stand in a booth and not be a very good actor. Somehow Thumper is even more annoying. He's not even a child actor anymore. He's more annoying.
I know we've railed on the child actors a lot, but one of the things I wrote down from this scene is I hate all their grown-up voices.
None of the voices fit. A friend of ours talks about this quite a lot, which is when you just get an actor to show up and do a voice without considering the animal or the character behind it, and it's never going to fit. The example she uses is Aslan in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which when you're watching, it doesn't gel. You're watching this big CGI lion, and you just hear Liam Neeson in a booth. You compare that to something like The Hobbit, which, not great films, but the performance of Benedict Cumberbatch as Smaug, most of it is actually in his performance, but they're adding the effects to be like, hey, this is believably a dragon. Whereas in Bambi, we've just got three blokes having a conversation over some footage of some animals.
It's really hard hearing them not just picturing three guys in boaters, jackets and trousers that are too high, all smoking.
So we've got our grown-up versions of Bambi, Thumper, and Flower. And at this point, they bump into the old great owl. He has a name.
Friend Owl.
Friend Owl.
Even though they're all jerks to him. And he's a jerk to them. They call him Friend Owl.
So Friend Owl shows up and tells them that during spring, everyone suffers from twitterpation, which basically just means falling in love.
Lust.
Yeah. There's no such thing as love between animals. They're just operating on instinct.
Is there an enemy owl? Sorry, I'm still on the Friend Owl thing.
He mentions he was talking to himself, so maybe he serves both roles and it's just, depending on what side of the bed he woke up on.
So they all optimistically say, Friend Owl? Hoping He's not just going to turn.
And he goes, "No, enemy owl, all women are evil." This owl very condescendingly warns them that they're going to become smitten with female counterparts, and they dismiss it as like, "That'll never happen to us, we're mates." And then immediately afterwards we have a sequence where one by one they all bump into a female version of themselves and then just abandon their friends.
I was close to praising this film for its use of foreshadowing, in that it sets up certain things that pay off later. There's things about the seasons, and I don't want to say the circle of life, that's certainly an aspect of it, but this is the complete opposite. And as you say, a character just says, this thing's going to happen. Within less than a minute, it happens.
It's fine as a sequence. If I'm rewatching this in future, I'll probably just fast forward a bit. Just because I don't like Thumper and Flower.
So what you want from Bambi, you want a cut that has no dialogue, no Thumper, no Flower, and no mating or relationships between the male and female characters.
I don't want any establishing shots of the relationships, because that doesn't really work. None of these animals, I think, court. If it was birds, fine. Throw the scenes in of the birds dancing together and singing.
And this comes back round to, these just aren't rounded characters at all. If you had to describe Bambi's personality, it'd just be like, cute. I've got nothing.
He's constantly out of his depth.
What a great character trait for a protagonist.
Speaking of, the end of this Twitterpation sequence has Bambi bumping into Feline again. They prance about a bit, and then just this random other deer who looks evil as hell shows up and is like, I'm gonna fight you. My question is, did the same thing happen to Flower and Thumper?
What, that deer showed up and they had to fight that deer?
I've already lost to a skunk and a rabbit, but I'm gonna take my chances against this deer.
I don't know why I was even going after the female skunk, to be honest. I'm a deer.
Other than the design of this other deer, which is just so over the top and evil, I do like the sequence. Again, really nice, non-verbal sequence with just beautiful animation. But Bambi wins. He goes off with Feline, presumably does the deed, and then hunters show up again, and now we're at the climax of the film.
And again, I don't feel there's really much for Bambi to overcome, because we never get a goal of what Bambi is working towards. Even very basic Disney films have some kind of plot. Dumbo wants to be reunited with his mum and find out why he's special. Snow White wants to meet her prince. Bambi doesn't seem to really want anything. Bambi just exists. And I like some aspects of that, and just saying, hey, we're just going to show you how nature is. We're not going to give this much of a narrative drive, but everything just being on fire isn't a dramatic finale. That's just a thing that's happening.
It's completely out of his control, and he doesn't really help anyone in the sequence. All he does is he runs back to his little den to look for Feline, because unlike his deadbeat dad, he actually went back to his partner and was like, oh, I better check that she's all right.
His dad's terrible. Like, early on, his mum says, oh, he's really brave. In every scene we see him, he's literally the first person to run away at every opportunity.
So, she mentions that in all of the forest, no other deer is half as old as he is, suggesting that that's because he is strong and brave. But it's just because he's a coward.
Ye who learns to run away lives to fight another day.
So Bambi goes to rescue Feline. She's ran off in the wrong direction, and the hunters are out, and as I mentioned, they are just shooting with gay abandon at this point, firing at anything that moves. They set a load of wild dogs on them. Well, I've mentioned that I like the animation in this sequence. However, it doesn't escape one of the problems that 2D animation has, and it will always be a problem in my view, which is you have a background and you have foreground cells. And if something is noticeable in the foreground, it means it's going to move. And we have a sequence where Bambi climbs up some rocks, and he climbs over some rocks that are really pristine and a slightly different colour from the background. And you're like, well, they're all going to fall and crush the dogs. And would you believe it? They all fall and crush the dogs. This isn't a criticism of what happens. It's a criticism of 2D animation as a medium. I wish that they'd overcome that, because they still haven't. If you see 2D animation today, unless you are drawing every frame separately, you still have this problem of that's going to move.
If you don't know what we're talking about, any time in a cartoon, particularly like Hanna-Barbera cartoons where the budget's very cheap, they'll go, oh, maybe one of these books on this bookcase does something, and there's one book that stands out. That's what we're talking about.
In an otherwise beautifully animated film, this is the only sequence where I'm like, yeah, maybe go back to that and touch it up a bit for a remaster, because it looks a bit shoddy. But they overcome the wolves, they escape the fire, and we reach the climax of the film, which is all of the animals being really excited about the birth of royalty, because that's all they have to be excited about. And where's Bambi? Oh, he's off with his deadbeat dad.
I just wrote, now Bambi is a dad, it's his turn to fuck off. Faline and Bambi have 2 fawns. They have a boy and a girl, so they have Veni daughter and Veni son. Come on.
I'm just going to leave that one hanging. So that's Bambi. I will say, I do like it. I think it is a really impressive film, and as we've sort of been going through these films, I've realised how much I admire Walt Disney, in the sense that he would have an idea, and it would be unique, and people hadn't really seen it before, and he was like, this is the power of animation. We can look at a year in the life of nature, and we can do it in a way that you otherwise can't do. He was a champion of using animation for that, not just for telling the same old story. And I have to admire the film for that. But yeah, I think I'm probably going to get a copy of Sony Vegas and just butcher this film to make it into something that I would actually watch.
I think it does what it's trying to do perfectly. I don't love what it's trying to do. I think it's a good idea, and I second what you say. As a piece of animation, it's worth watching. Are you going to walk away with it with any new insights about the world?
Quick correction. It does what it's trying to do very well. The Lion King does what it's trying to do perfectly.
Yeah, touche. And I think that's everything on Bambi. Liam, is there anything else you want to add?
There is only one thing we still need to discuss, and that is, throughout all of Bambi, which is the sexiest character, and why is it Bambi's deadbeat dad?
So, years ago, we stumbled across a list that someone had collated saying who they thought the sexiest Disney characters were, with no criteria, and they gave Bambi's dad a 5 out of 5. Now, in the context of ranking all the characters in Bambi on sexiness, I think that's fair. In terms of ranking every Disney character, I don't think it's realistic or accurate to say Disney's dad is the sexiest. Disney's dad? Bambi's dad? Man, that was a Freudian slip.
I will add, I've never been able to find this article again to prove it and show to people. But the thing that impresses me most is we clicked on it expecting, oh, it's just going to be someone leering over the various princesses. No, it's just all the dads. I think Triton was second.
Yeah, it's someone with a lot of dad issues. The only other contender I would posit would be Lady Thumper.
I was going to say, is it the sexy rabbit?
Yeah, it's the sexy rabbit.
The problem with that sexy rabbit is she has terrible taste, so that sort of docks a few points.
I love that you hate Thumper. Oh, there's so many more objectionable characters in the world.
Talking of objectionable, there's just one last thing to do before we go, and that's to decide whether or not we think Bambi deserves a place on Waly Gisnep's animated classics.
Liam, do you have the quill and the parchment ready?
I've rolled out the parchment, I've got my lucky pen here, made from a rabbit's foot. So Ben, does Bambi make it onto Waly Gisnep's animated classics?
I think this is probably the closest call we've had yet, but for me, I'm gonna have to say no. You said earlier to me that everything Bambi is trying to do, the Lion King does better, which is a statement I agree with. So then I have to ask myself, does Bambi bring anything unique that the Lion King doesn't? Not really. Obviously it's got a different setting, it's maybe a different time period, etc. But as a side-by-side comparison, it's not favourable. So for me, it's a no.
I've got to say, I'm glad you've gone with no, because it's not as close for me. I don't think this deserves a place on the list. Again, I've not got the nostalgia for it, because I didn't watch it as a child, but I know this is a beloved classic. Watching it for myself, it's fine.
So that's our conclusion of Bambi. It does not make it onto the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics. So far, only consisting of Dumbo and Pinocchio, with Fantasia as a backup stack up on the back of the list. Liam, what are we going to be looking at next week?
Starting from next week, we're going to be working through a series of films that are known as the package films from Disney. This was during the war to save on costs. Disney started producing films that were just sort of a collection of animated shorts instead. And I've got to say, if Bambi didn't make the list, I'm not hopeful for a lot of these films.
Well, we'll keep the quill and parchment ready just in case. And in the meantime, let us know whether you think Bambi should go on the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics. Otherwise, we will see you next time for the first of the package films.